So I'm Michael Clemens. Thank you very much for inviting me here. In 20 quick minutes, I'm going to sketch a fresh agenda for research on skilled migration and development. I'm going to do it by stitching together several papers, a few of them by me. So if you wanted to know what economists think about skilled migration and development, you might go to Google Scholar, look up the most cited, most influential papers on this subject, and here's what you'd find. You would find that skilled migration is a loss to those left behind. You'd find that it's undoubtedly detrimental, that it's extremely detrimental in Africa, and that it's clearly above optimal levels. Most cited, most influential papers take a very dark view of skilled migration for sure. Now, something that all four of those papers have in common is a particular production function, and I'm going to use that to stitch together a series of challenges that this older, more established, more influential literature has faced. This production function occurs in all four of the aforementioned papers, with different letters, of course. GDP per capita on the left-hand side is a function of some total factor productivity parameter theta times human capital in the country to a Cobb-Douglas exponent. Human capital in the country is the difference between H, total human capital stock that country has, minus H star, human capital that has left the country as skilled migrants. So a few challenges that that work in this vein, making this particular assumption, has faced. The first, historically speaking, was data. We didn't have good data 15 years ago to even measure the extent of skilled migration. Another, maybe, let's say 13, 15 years ago, starting with the work of Andrew Mountford, Oded Stark, was a challenge to the specification of this production function. Maybe human capital stock is a function of the skilled migration through incentives created in the labor market for investment in human capital in order to reap the high returns to human capital abroad. Another challenge has been that total factor productivity is a function of human capital immigration through mechanisms such as technology transfer, another form of misspecification of this production function. Yet another emerging from the last maybe 10, 15 years of the growth literature has been the idea that there's even a more fundamental misspecification error with this production function, and it's that these variables are perhaps better modeled as simultaneously caused by emitted variables or in fact by growth itself. And a final challenge that rests perhaps in the public literature is a closer consideration of the effects of policy on skilled migration and perhaps unintended consequences. So I want to go through all of these, and I've put the top two in green because the literature has really made a lot of progress in those areas. The third in yellow because I think there's a lot left to do, and the last two in red because really the sky is just open. And if you're looking for subjects, I want to encourage you to consider them. So let's start with data. As I mentioned, when work in this area began, empirical work in this area began, it was hard to get any data on skilled migration. Now, thanks to pioneering efforts by Jean-Christophe Dumont, Frédéric Dauquier, and many who followed them, we now have quite good data, census-based data, on bilateral stocks of skilled migrants by skill level at different points in time. Now, when those numbers first came out, the reaction of the profession was something vaguely like, wow, those numbers are really big. Look at all of the skilled Liberians and skilled Haitians that are outside their countries. That must be really bad. I had quite a different reaction. Some ideas I talk about in a paper called Do Visas Kill that I was pleased to present here at this conference 8 years ago. And it was that those very numbers suggest that skilled migration per se is not a major determinant of skill stocks at the origin. And to show you what I mean, I just want to glance at some of the data. So here is a scatter of all countries on Earth where the horizontal axis is human capital outside the country of origin. The vertical axis is human capital inside the country of origin. That is, the horizontal axis is university graduates born and trained in the country of origin who are outside in an OECD country, so they show up in the census, divided by population at the origin. And the vertical axis is just number of university graduates in the country of origin per capita. So note well, in that naive production function, that zero-sum production function, movement in this space can only occur along a reference line of slope -1 that I've added to this graph. That's not a regression line, it's a reference line, the yellow dotted line. One more skilled graduate outside the country means one less skilled graduate inside the country. Now those blue arrows are showing how these countries moved during the period 1990 to 2000, which is the only period during which it's possible to do exactly this calculation with existing data. And you don't see a lot of movement along that line. Even quite small countries, you can see here Jamaica, Tonga, Fiji, Panama, are not moving along that line. They're moving in other complex ways. I'm going to drop the smallest countries in the former Soviet Union. The x-axis has stretched out here, so that yellow dotted line still has slope -1. You're just not seeing a lot of movement along that line. In fact, if I drop the country labels so you can better see these arrows, you can see that there are only 4 arrows on this graph that have any negative slope at all, much less a typical slope of -1. And for every arrow that has a negative slope, there are 10 that don't. So this doesn't mean, obviously, that there is no mechanistic relationship at all. When a skilled graduate gets on the plane, that's one fewer at home. But it does mean that as a quantitative determinant of the human capital stock, that simple mechanistic zero-sum relationship is getting overwhelmed by other things, just blown out of the water by other forces. So what are some of those forces? Well, one that we mentioned earlier is this idea that the prospect to emigrate might influence human capital investment and thus the stock of human capital at the origin. Emerging from theory, not testable for a long time for lack of data, in a paper called Skilled Migration and Skill Creation with Satish Chand, we take an empirical approach that uses a natural experiment. The natural experiment is in Fiji, and to make a very long story short, Fiji is, very roughly speaking, a bi-ethnic society divided between 2 ethnic groups, what Fiji Islanders themselves call Fijians, indigenous people, and Indians, or Fiji Islanders of Indian origin. And starting in 1987, there was a series of military coups that Indians in Fiji perceived to greatly disadvantage their position in society. They started to leave en masse, and particularly skilled Indians relative to skilled Fijians. So here, in 1986, the year before the first coup, and 1996, 9 years later, at 2 census points, you can see the fraction of tertiary graduates by ethnic group, Indians in red, Fijians in blue, before and after the coup. Just a gigantic gap of 20 percentage points in the fraction who are outside the country, that is, showing up in the censuses of Australia and New Zealand, the 2 principal destinations. Fiji is a small, poor, isolated island country. This is a gigantic, extremely rapid exodus of skilled workers. If there were to be a large impact on skill stocks at the origin per se from this kind of extremely rapid, large-scale movement, this is exactly where we would expect to see it, and this is what happened to skill stocks. So from full universe census data, this is the number of people in each ethnic group, Indians in red, Fijians in blue, who have tertiary education attainment. The Indians tracked exactly the Fijians during this period. And as we discuss in the paper, by looking at things like exactly what they were studying and mapping that to visa requirements for Australia and New Zealand, we argued that this huge and fully compensating entry into tertiary education was actually caused by the fact that these people were expecting to participate in the global labor market. So these forces are very real and they're very large. That's labor market incentives. What about other markets? So there's an exciting, quite recent literature suggesting that skilled immigrants are conduits for technology transfer in ways that could shape total factor productivity. I would highlight a fascinating paper in Restat by Bill Kerr of Harvard Business School, where he demonstrates this quite innovatively, showing patent citations according to the ethnic identity as embodied in the names of the people who are citing patents across borders. It's been known for quite a while that international migrant networks foster trade, but it wasn't until recent work by Giovanni Peri and others that it's been known that skilled migrants in particular have a much larger effect. Same for capital flows as measured by foreign direct investment. It's been known for a while that migrant networks cause foreign direct investment. Recent research suggests a particular effect for skilled migrants. And a tantalizing recent and developing literature suggests that skilled migrant networks could even be a conduit for the transfer of things like institutions of democracy in Antonio Spilimbergo's AER paper, and fertility norms in the research of Michel Ben and others. Note well, all of these things happen through migrant networks, whether or not the physical person ever goes home permanently. Now we're getting to bigger problems. The last 10 or 15 years of the growth and development literature has had trouble detecting the causal relationship that is embodied, assumed by this naive zero-sum production function. That is, since the work of Holland-Jones and Bills and Klenow, this literature has had trouble detecting large effects of human capital accumulation on economic growth. In particular, economists have had trouble detecting the large human capital externalities that are embodied in that assumed production function. So here I'm talking about the work of Ciccone and Peri and Ristad and many others summarized by Leng and Topol's handbook chapter. Daron Acemoglu wrote a literature review last year in which he summarized this literature saying that the evidence we have is, quote, not compatible with human capital externalities of any significant magnitude, unquote. So what's going on? Well, a couple of AER papers last year used different methods to suggest that quality of education, actual learning, might be an important omitted variable here. We're not comparing apples to apples when we're comparing university graduates from Niger to university graduates from France. That might help us make sense of the growth and development literature, but it's not good news for the zero-sum production function in the migration and development literature, because if a skilled graduate leaves Niger, they leave with the quality of education that they received in Niger, and to the extent that that's low, that means that the effect on growth and development of Niger is less, not more. Another strand of this literature suggests that nonlinearities in the production function might be important. That is, not only might the production function not have the Cobb-Douglas form or even a linear form, but might look more like this, which some of you might recognize as the O-ring production function due to Michael Kramer. That is, there could be substantial range over which the returns to scale are increasing, and that for countries with very low human capital, the marginal return to human capital might be correspondingly low. Finally, the entire migration and development literature emerged from the international economics literature and the labor literature. And it has yet to seriously engage with the public economics literature when it comes to policy recommendations in this area. I want to briefly mention one of those that I discussed in a paper called A Case Against Taxes and Quotas on Skilled Emigration, which is in the Journal of Globalization and Development. So for a lot of economists, notably early work by Jagdish Bhagwati in the 70s, skilled migration is an open and shut case for Pigouvian taxes and quotas. After all, skilled worker leaves a poor country, there's a negative externality exerted on that country, and a Pigouvian tax or quota could internalize the externality, raise social efficiency. The problem with that line of reasoning is that Nobel laureate Ronald Coase found half a century ago that that reasoning doesn't actually obtain necessarily. Specifically, he showed that when two parties to an externality cannot negotiate with each other due to high transactions costs, the socially efficient solution is for the entitlement to exert the externality to be vested in the party with the highest cost of mitigating the externality. And when we're talking about skilled migration, in general, that is definitely the migrant. It costs a lot more for a skilled migrant not to migrate from Malawi. The income forgone could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars typically than it costs to train a new skilled migrant in Malawi. That's under the case of high transactions costs, no negotiation, the socially efficient solution to entitle the migrant to migrate. A more perhaps equitable way to arrive at the socially efficient solution, and Coase discusses this as well, is for policy interventions to be targeted at reducing those transactions costs so that the parties can negotiate with themselves. In this case, that means migrants and the state negotiating upfront for who's going to pay for the costs of education. And I discussed an institutional form that could lower transaction costs in that way for that purpose in a paper called Global Skill Partnerships, which is in the IZA Journal of Labor Policy. So I want to close with some recommendations. Let me start by saying what I don't think we need more of. We really do not need more cross-country regressions based on census data that treats every university graduate as a lump, that makes heroic statements about causal relationships based on instrumental variables that are flimsy in the sense that they are transparently invalid and perhaps weak as well. Here's some things we really do need more of. We need a lot more movement from censuses to surveys to learn in detail about skilled migrants, what in fact they know, what they do after migration, how they interact with each other and their countries of origin. John Gibson and David McKenzie's paper in the EJ is a model in this regard, where they did the hard work of collecting that data themselves. We need to learn a lot more about the role that participating in the global labor market has in determining investment in human capital in the first place, how much people get and what forms they get. Natural experiments are a very promising approach here, championed in a great handbook chapter by McKenzie and Young. We need to learn a lot more about these effects happening through other markets, how total factor productivity is shaped by these international linkages that skilled migrants form. I want to highlight a fascinating new paper by Danny Bahar and Hillel Rappaport, where they use product-level data to suggest that skilled migrants change the range of products that countries are able to produce and export. That is, skilled migration can actually shape the comparative advantage of nations, something that is just so far beyond the naive zero-sum production function that it really suggests big things that are being missed. And finally, if you are young, brilliant, and courageous, and I know that many of you are all of those things, and you want to hunt the really big game in this literature, find a research design that can detect human capital externalities. Giovanni Peri and Daron Adjemolo are extremely smart guys. If they can't find them, it means they're very hard to find. And you can make a gigantic contribution. The sky is open for you to make a really big contribution by finding a way to find them. It will have important implications for this literature, as well as obviously many other literatures. Massa and Moretti have an interesting firm-level approach that they talk about in the AER, but really the sky is open for you here. As you write, I have a plea, and I want to close with this plea. Here's how I'm going to say it. Suppose I sent you this paper. Fresh new research by Michael Clemens. The family abandonment rate and child welfare. And in that paper, I define the family abandonment rate as the rate at which women work outside the home. You might email me back and say, Michael, what are you doing? It's very strange to use such pejorative, normative language in an ostensibly scientific and objective investigation of a phenomenon. Wouldn't it be much better to just say what it is, female labor force participation in the child welfare? Neutral language like that would make it a lot easier for me to take your research seriously, because it would suggest that you're not defining away women's rights in favor of the family's rights. It would suggest that you didn't arrive at the conclusion before even running any regressions, et cetera. If you criticized me in that way, you'd be right. So what then am I supposed to do with paper after paper in leading economics journals talking about brain drain, brain drain, brain drain? It's time to stop, it's time to drop this normative, pejorative language. It's not scientific language. It was invented by nationalistic journalists in tabloid papers of the UK in 1963. It has no place in scientific discussion. And move forward with innovative methods and objective viewpoint, neutral scientific language. And I honestly can't wait to read what some of you might write on this subject. Thanks a lot.